It's Law Talk with BJ, the podcast where trial attorney and legal commentator BJ Bernstein and her guests discuss the latest issues from around the legal world. BJ is a frequent commentator on television and radio. She's unique in that she not only comments on legal issues, having been lead counsel on numerous high-profile cases of national interest, but her relatable personal style allows the viewer to understand the law behind the headlines and why it's important. Now, here's your host, BJ Bernstein.
Welcome to Law Talk with BJ. This episode is with an incredible lawyer who's with an organization who's made changes in Georgia and it's reverberated around the country. And with us is Sarah Geraghty, attorney with the Southern Center for Human Rights, who has repeatedly done work for those who don't have an advocate. They may not be able to hire a lawyer. And a organization that finds and goes after the systematic prejudices that have been in our system and affect minorities, affect people without money. And she's going to talk to us about some of the most recent issues. So first, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, BJ. I'm so glad to be here.
So what I want to dive into is what has been in the paper a great deal, and that is the privatization of the courts by particularly smaller jurisdictions, and the bail that's set and the fines that are assessed about people who could never afford them, and the complications it creates, and really almost a destruction of people's lives for something as simple as a speeding ticket or an ordinance violation where you get assessed a fine and you can't afford to pay it. And I think y'all have been fighting against this for a while. So how did this come to the attention of the Southern Center as a focus to make change?
Well, as you know, the Southern Center has for years represented people facing the death penalty. So moving into the area of representing people in misdemeanor cases was quite a sea change for our practice. But we did it for a couple of reasons. The first is that we were getting a lot of complaints from people who were coming before the misdemeanor and traffic courts in Georgia. And what we were hearing from those people is that they were being locked up or threatened with incarceration only because they didn't have the money to pay criminal fines and fees. You know, these are the courts with which most people come into contact at some point, right? I mean, most of us are going to get a traffic ticket or a ticket for...
Can I plead the fifth on my traffic ticket experience?
You may.
Thank you.
You may. But many of us have had this experience of coming before court. And, you know, I wonder if I might share a story from a case that we had just recently.
Tell me about it.
Okay. So this was someone who was in a municipal court that shall remain nameless in the Atlanta area. This was someone who had a ticket for having an expired tag and no proof of insurance. And let's just start with the fact that those are two offenses that are largely associated with poverty in the first place.
Poverty or forgetfulness. I will plead forgetfulness, and I got pulled over. No joke. This is public record, but I got pulled over, but I could go and pay my tag immediately.
Right.
And the folks you're talking about, the reason wasn't forgetfulness. It was their circumstances in life and inability to pay.
And that's certainly what it was in this case. And so here's what happened. This gentleman went to court. He was assessed a fine of $1,200 and additional fees amounting to several $100s. And then only because he couldn't pay that on or before the day of court, he was put on probation with a private company. When he couldn't pay the monthly amount that they demanded every month, this is what the company did. It required him to come back more and more frequently. And this is a sort of tactic that we often see with these private companies. If you can't bring in the amount that they demand, they have you come back once every 2 weeks, once every week, in some cases, a couple of times a week.
So wait, I want to slow you down for a minute because I want to back up. So the initial fine amount, that in of itself sounds shocking for what it is.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And that ties into what's been in the media a great deal, and I think y'all have been a part of some of the articles where there's a discussion that a lot of cities actually rely a great deal on their citizenry or those driving through it paying for the government instead of just assessing property taxes, whatever, to pay for the services. It's almost like, I hope you come and violate the law here because we need the money and we're going to charge you for it.
That's absolutely right. A lot of places keep track of the amount, of the extent to which, like, municipalities rely on courts for portions of their income. And there are lots of places in Georgia and lots of places all over the country that rely on their courts, like upwards of a third, sometimes even more, to fund their city revenue. A lot of these places pre-budget these amounts, and so therefore really expect for these for citations to occur and for people to come to court and be required to pay those fines. It is a really perverse way of using what is supposed to be a justice system. But sadly, more and more these days, we are really seeing this over reliance on courts to fund municipalities, and it has some really unfortunate consequences, as it did in the case that we're just chatting about. What eventually happened in this case was that a warrant was put out for this gentleman, and
a warrant for arrest.
In other words,
for not paying that fine.
Yep.
That wasn't because of forgetfulness, but because they literally could not pay. The probation office, and I guess this private company has a way of letting the court know to issue a warrant that they are violating the probation and the order of the court.
Right. And this is, we all agree, actions have consequences. Offenses need to have certain penalties. Like, everyone agrees with that, right? But this was someone who actually was really trying to make it work. He had paid $900+ on this case.
Wow.
And he had reported 12 times to the probation office. But the warrant said, go ahead and arrest this guy because he hasn't paid all of his fines and fees, and because we wanted him to report 24 times instead of 12 times. Now, here's what the point that I want to make. How do you keep a job when you have to report to the probation office for a what is essentially a very minor traffic offense, and you have to do so once a week or even once every 2 weeks? How do you keep a job? And the answer is you don't.
You don't. And
You don't.
even if you say, because some people would sit here and say, well, you get a lunch hour and you can go. But for instance, not sure that we're not saying where this is, but let's look at the metropolitan Atlanta area. If I work in downtown Atlanta, but I got a ticket up in Gwinnett County with the best of traffic or taking whatever way get there, that is sometimes 2 hours round trip.
Right.
Plus actually going to the office and sitting there. Waiting to meet with the probation officer.
Exactly, for an hour, 2 hours, or more. That's right.
So you've got 4 to 6 hours. You can actually get to the doctor quicker. And doctors are slow.
Man, yeah, definitely.
Than going to a probation office on a nonviolent offense.
Right.
Because these offices that you're talking about and these offenses in these courts, they are not handling the violent cases that create so much fear in the community.
That's right. So, this is a national phenomenon, of course, and we saw a lot of this discussed through the Department of Justice report discussing Ferguson. This idea of revenue-generating policing and revenue-generating courts. And, of course, so often these practices are visited against communities of color. And that's
and as
the
a
case
reminder,
here in Georgia.
Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was shot, killed. There were riots afterwards, and a whole lot of things with regard to the criminal justice system with that. But it created a focus nationally on what was happening to the minority population of Ferguson. And again, the same thing, the money that was involved, how it was involved, and how you're dragging people down.
Mm-hmm.
And the federal government got involved and did a report afterwards that you're referring to, and highlighted things. And yet, from what you're saying, a federal report that shows the injustice of this is not enough necessarily to move the compass, particularly when we're talking about privatized companies who are doing this for profit.
Right. And an interesting fact about our state of Georgia is that Georgia is the epicenter of the private probation industry. We have about 30 private probation companies operating in over 600 misdemeanor and traffic courts in the state. And as a consequence, we have the highest number of people on probation of any state in the country, far, far higher. I think it's about 4 times as high as the next highest state. I think that's largely attributable to the fact that we have this booming private probation industry. 80% of people on misdemeanor probation in Georgia are represented by private companies. And it's just been our experience over the last decade that these companies are fundamentally incompatible with the fair administration of justice in our misdemeanor courts. You can't serve 2 masters, one master being the court and the justice system, and the other master being the bottom line and profit. They are just incompatible, and we see this in case after case, year after year.
I just don't think the founding fathers, when they set up all of this elaborate system of justice, which was what made this country great to begin with, the fact that an individual has a right, that you're not, that you can have an attorney, that you can have a voice. And whoever would think that a corporate entity would be the ones deciding the liberty of someone.
Can I share another story?
Oh, well, I love stories. You can tell.
So this is the case of a man named Mr. Edwards, who's was from a rural community in South Georgia. Mr. Edwards got a citation for burning leaves in his yard without a permit. And he came to court on the appointed day, and he was given a fine of $500
for burning leaves.
Right. And because he couldn't pay that amount on the day of court, he was put on probation again with a private company that charged $523 additional dollars for supervising, and I use that words in air quotes, supervising him on probation. Now, probation is a very intrusive arrangement, right? I mean, this is a thing where when you're on probation, there's a whole list of things that you can't do, right? You can't hang around nefarious people. You can't drink alcohol. You have to consent to have officers search your person and your property. You have to pay. You have to report all these things. And if you don't do them, you face incarceration. So he was put on probation for a year. And because he couldn't pay a down payment on this now $1,000+ that he owed, he was hauled off to jail, where he remained until someone in his family came to essentially ransom him out, only because he didn't have money to pay. Moreover, he spent a year on probation. My office encountered Mr. Edwards after he had been on probation for over a year. His sentence should have expired. It did, in fact, expire. And yet this probation office was requiring him to come in and to report and to pay weekly, even though his case was over and he was to be off probation, and threatening to jail him all the while. So
wait, how when his case is over?
Yep.
What was the justification that they gave, or did they ever give one?
This was among a number of cases that we later discovered was on the company's, quote, expired pay docket. That meant that the sentences were over, but they were still essentially hounding people for payment. And
so like the phone calls, when you don't, for poor people who, finance something, perhaps you buy something in a store, a washer and dryer, and you finance it forever, they call.
Right.
But that's a private arrangement you made. This is the government.
This is the government, and the difference here being that they can take you and lock you up under the way that we do things in our legal system right now. And that is just so fundamentally unfair, and we continue to see various variations on this theme of criminalization of poverty and threatening jail, taking people to jail because they don't have money.
So I want to go back to this because you just said that it had expired. So basically they just shift from a model of we can't legally, like at this moment, because the sentence is expired, if we went to court, a judge could not tell them. If he had gotten to court, judge would say, well, it's over. Whatever you collected, and I'm not going to go any further. But because it is a private company, they switch over to the model, like when you buy something financing, and just never quit calling you till you pay.
And of course, it's utterly illegal to have done that. And that company, my office filed a lawsuit against the company, and the company is no longer in business in the state of Georgia because it had turned out that it was employing these kinds of tactics to abuse and incarcerate a lot of other people as well. But that is one of the tactics that the companies have used in the past. And in fact, we still see it today. I have a colleague who...
Wait, before you go to that, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
So is it, when you play the game Whack-A-Mole and you hit them down and then it pops up somewhere else?
Absolutely.
So did this company that was involved in this case with this gentleman pop up somewhere else under another iteration, or is it still existing, really just not under the corporate name that you know it as?
That's an excellent question. That particular company does not exist that I know of anymore. However, another private company came right in and took its place. And one of the reasons for that is that Georgia, and this is not true, the private probation, the industry exists in other places, but one of the reasons that it is so entrenched in Georgia is that our legislature in its wisdom essentially codified, gave municipalities the option of contracting with private companies to provide for probation services. It's something that the industry refers to as offender-funded services. And I am here to tell you that this is a bad idea. It appeals on the surface to folks who run government entities because they are told, they're sold the system by saying you don't have to pay for the cost of supervision.
And you can understand, perhaps the legislature who's not educated on this at that point, it sounds good to say to your constituents, listen, we spent X amount of dollars on, these are your tax dollars. We're going to stop using your tax dollars. We're going to make the bad people pay for it. But then it creates an inequity. And for things that would not put you in any sort of status to say you're, quote, a bad criminal, that we should all fear and have a legitimate reason in being wanting an incarceration or a punishment to that level.
And boy, do we all pay on the other end in terms of loss of jobs, cost of incarceration, destabilizing people who lose their jobs and lose their place to live and that sort of thing.
Then they need government subsidies. Yep. Their children have issues. Yep. The education, the investment in education, and people leave school to go to work. They don't get their high school degree.
Right.
It goes on and on and on.
Right.
And it traps people.
Right. And again, I don't mean to suggest that that there shouldn't be consequences for violating the law, violating rules. We agree there have to be consequences. I just think it is past time to rethink how we are handling these lower level offenses. And I have a lot of thoughts about how to do that. I mean, one would certainly be looking at the exorbitant fines. I mean, sometimes we see cases in which folks who have like a bunch of junk in their yard, that kind of, old car in the yard and a wash tub and I saw one case recently where someone had a $6,000 fine. For.
Can I tell you, it's hard to shock me because, as my listeners know, in the business for a long time. But I thought you were going to say something like $500, $1,000.
Yeah,
$6,000 for having junk in your yard.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
No,
people can't pay it. It sets people up to fail, and so you got the fine. That money tends to go to the city or the county, but then you also have fees that go to the probation company. Then you also have surcharges that go to various state funds.
And let's talk about the surcharges a little bit. In that, I know that when I go to court, or I'm getting ready to go to court, I have to say to a client, okay, you're going to pay $1,000 fine,
right.
And then if it's a drug offense, there's a 50% surcharge, and there's a jail construction fee, and there's a probation supervision fee, and then there's another fee. And by the time I'm done, and even in a serious offense, $1,000 is more like $2,400.
Right, on and on and on and on. The jail, the construction fund, the library fund, the police officers' retirement fund, the spinal cord injury fund. And I'm not saying that these are not, important funds. It's just that we have come to a place where the punishment does not fit the crime.
And in a weird way, we're wanting people to break the law so we could fund people with other things that maybe we should just be paying for and budgeting for because as a society we need them. It's that full disclosure. There's a reason why a long time ago in contracts, the tiny print, you can't have the tiny print. It has to be a little bit bigger so you can actually read it.
Right.
And yet our legislators are creating tiny, tiny, tiny print that no one could ever know would be the consequence of making a mistake.
Yep.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is, and it really this is an issue that affects just hundreds of thousands of people, and so it's one that we feel that it's very important to focus on, to keep people's attention on.
Is there any way, or do you feel like that there's some folks in the legislature and the governmental sectors that are starting to realize, regardless of party, because I'll say this, I know we get into, to be careful with politics a little bit, but that there are champions of justice on both sides of the aisle who
Absolutely.
understand it.
Yeah.
Is there anything shifting that you've seen?
I think so. I really think so. I'm feeling really hopeful about it. I mean, we certainly have seen since the Ferguson report that we talked about a moment ago, I think a shift in the way in the public dialogue about this issue, about the criminalization of poverty and the way our criminal legal system treats people who are facing misdemeanor offenses. There is a realization that some of the ways that we're operating may need a second look. That's certainly been the case here in Georgia, where our governor's Criminal Justice Reform Council have taken a hard look and made some positive changes. And the council deserves great credit for that. But I want to make the point that even today, after the council's recommendations, after some legislation that was aimed to get at some of these issues, we still really have not retreated from this place where it has become normalized to take away people's liberty because they don't have enough money to pay a criminal offense.
And let me ask you this, because a lot of places I'll go are smaller courts where, especially with younger offenders, they'll say, well, we want you to go work at the recycling center, or we want you to do work in exchange for it. That still sometimes can create the same consequences that you're talking about financial, in that you are still having to take a day off of work to go do that community service. I know I live in a very rural area, and when I drive into the city, I will see, the work, and they're wearing the slip bashes, community service worker, and they're picking up trash, all on the road.
Yep.
And that in some ways, people look at it and say, gosh, that's great. They're out there and they're sweating and they're picking up the trash and they're learning a lesson. But maybe that's taking away from providing for their family.
Yeah. Well, I think what the system is missing right now is individualized consideration of what should happen, like at a case-by-case basis, right? Because the volume of cases that come before these little courts, and there are hundreds of them, don't permit for a judge to make those kinds of individualized determinations about what's happening in a particular case. And part of the reason for that circles right back to the fact that many places rely on these courts to make money. It's really interesting that there's a libertarian public interest group, Institute for Justice, that has just filed a lawsuit contesting the practices in the city of Doraville, here, a suburb of Atlanta.
I've had some clients there with some very hefty fines.
Right.
Oh my, yeah.
Well, what the folks at the Institute for Justice found is that the city of Doraville relies on its court for, I think, a fifth to a third of its revenue. It pre-budgets, meaning it sort of, it anticipates and expects that this money will come in from its court, and that the interesting legal claim is it's a due process bias claim. What that means is that the claim is you can't have a judge or a municipality that has a financial interest in churning money from its court, essentially.
Because it's in the budget line. You were going to get X amount of dollars at a Doraville Municipal Court. Let's just set a number.
Yep.
Let's say this year we're going to get $500,000 from it.
Mm-hmm.
And if that judge knows that,
Yep.
those police officers know that,
Right.
those probation officers know that, and really the number is much higher.
Right.
And that what it sounds like they're saying in this lawsuit is, how can it be a justice system, independent judge
Mm-hmm.
who's deciding what the application of law should be when you know in the back of your mind and you have a mandate, in essence, that you must produce that much money or our city can't survive and provide the services, including paying for you,
Right.
judge,
Exactly.
probation officer, police officers, enforcement of misdemeanor, residential enforcement of different laws, when they go through and look at people's yards and say, like you're saying, there's a bunch of junk. We have to clear it out to keep the property values high.
Yep. Yep. And I'm here to say that the harms that come from the way we do business in these courts are real. And, the one that I lose sleep over at night is where you have a situation, and I've had many clients in this situation, I'm not kidding, where they lose a child or their children to state custody because they are taken into custody on a misdemeanor probation violation. Their children are taken by
the Department of Family and
right.
Children's Services and put in foster care.
Now that is a harm. I mean, if can you imagine the rage? The rage I would feel as a parent, watching my kid get taken from my care over my inability to pay for a traffic ticket. I mean, that just should not happen. And we need to be working to make sure that we don't have our criminal legal system operating in that way.
And in those communities, particularly minority communities, you have not just that traffic enforcement to get money, but also, wanting probable cause to pull someone over so that you have the opportunity to search to hope that you find something more. Mm-hmm. There's a legal term, pretextual. Sometimes it's legitimate. Like if you are speeding, they do have a right to pull you over. But we know from so many other cases that, if BJ and Sarah are riding in the car together and I get pulled over, I'm smiling, I hand him my driver's license. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. I know my tag's expired. Yes, sir. I know I can go, here, Miss Bernstein, here's your ticket. You don't have to go to court if you just pay it in advance.
Absolutely.
And they have a nice online system, which the online system tags on, $15 more because you're paying it in advance to go there and process it. And you've done it. But then take it to the family who perhaps they're Hispanic, perhaps they're Black, whatever it is, and they are a targeted community sometimes to be suspicion of. When you sit there and smile, oh, it's not go on with your day, Mr. Cook or Mr. Jones. It's, can you step out of the car? Or I smelled an odor, or, there's all these things that can be said. I know, again, having been a prosecutor and defense attorney and reading police reports, it's like the same reason given why someone gets out of the car. I think I talked on one of these episodes. I had a client who they said his taillight was out. And fortunately, and then they go, we smell marijuana. There was zero marijuana in the car. He had his, cell phone was able to capture that the tag was paid for. They just didn't contemplate anybody filming the quote reasons they always give to pull someone over of his race at that time of night, hoping that they get something more.
Well, and here's a point that I think is an important one, which is that these kinds of revenue-generated and often racially discriminatory, quote, justice practices, they really undermine communities' faith in the legal system. They undermine people's faith in the police, in judges, in the courts, and in the rule of law itself. And that, I think, is perhaps the most dangerous thing that we risk when we continue with these practices. And, I just think of one other example from one of our cases from a few years ago, in which we represented, again, somebody who was on probation with one of the small companies. She was on probation for some, very minor traffic offenses. She didn't have any money and she was being threatened with jail. She sold her kitchen mixer to raise funds to pay. at some point she asked about could she do community service. And I kid you not, BJ, the community service option at this probation provider's office was cleaning the office of the private probation company. Can you imagine? I mean, this was like this is the extent to which we have fallen, right? Cleaning the bathroom of the private probation office was considered community service.
That's a breakdown.
Yeah, that's
It's a total breakdown.
Yeah.
And as we're drawing to a close, one, thank you for sharing all this, because I think, again, part of the purpose of this podcast is if we really understand it and get behind the 2 to 3 minute story or the quick thing that we read in the paper, to realize what we've done, that maybe we can fix it. And we've been doing it. Everybody knows I selected tea appropriate for my guests. And this particular tea had, the box says it's an earthing, calming, Tulsa, sweet licorice, powerful ashwagandha tea, but they gave it a name, and it's gratitude tea. And we have gratitude for you, for the Southern Center for Human Rights, for those who work for the public interest in law that protects us. I mean, I know lawyers, we get a tough rap. But there are a lot of lawyers who are truly the foot soldiers for justice. So thank you for sharing this today. And I want to have you back because I know there's more things brewing over there that y'all are going to come out and get it into the courts. And that's the other part of what the Southern Center does, is that you still have faith in the Constitution. You find these horrible things, but get access to the courts, get access to a higher court, have the judges who really look and read and listen. And it's how we have a peaceful society to improve as opposed to chaos. So thank you, Sarah.
And my pleasure. I'm a huge fan, BJ.
Bye.
This podcast is not to be construed as legal advice. With any legal issue, you should reach out to a professional attorney that practices law in the state and area of law for which you need information or consultation. Law Talk with BJ does not establish an attorney-client relationship, which is only formed when you have hired an attorney and signed an engagement agreement or contract. It's Law Talk with BJ music theme written and produced by Atlanta Audible. This podcast copyright 2018, BJ Bernstein, Esquire.